Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here this morning. Hope this finds you well. If you were in Texas or in Louisiana, I hope that you're in a safe place and that you realize that we're concerned for you and praying for you and hoping that all is well. I am really happy to be with you this morning. I'm really happy to talk to you about the acronym HOW: honest, open, and willing. When that became real in my life, a lot of things changed for me. And the first thing that I had to look at was, so if we look at here in the West, we hear people talk often about here in the West, or in the West, the primary form of spiritual practice is Christianity. Well, what is the West? West of what? And so what's really good to understand is that Asia and the old Ottoman Empire were known as the East. Asia, as we know, is the East. China is the East. And what was the Ottoman Empire is now the Middle East. And so the practice of Christianity, which is the primary spiritual practice in the West, is in an area that is west of the Middle East and Asia. Now, in Asia, there are different forms of spiritual practice. There's Buddhism, and there's Hinduism, and there's Taoism, uh, there's Shintoism, there's Confucianism, there's a number of them. In the Middle East, their primary practice is Islam. Now, Islam, and also in the Middle East, one of the practices, although not the primary, but one of the practices is Judaism. And in the West, we have Christianity. Many of us know that Judaism, Islam, and Christianity are all connected and are the what's known as monotheist spiritual practices. Monotheism means one God. If you look at Hinduism, Hinduism has multiple gods or multiple deities. If you look at Buddhism, there is no God at all. And so here in the West, we practice Christianity, which is one of the three sects of monotheism. The first of the three sects was Judaism, or the Hebrews. The second is Christianity, and the third is Islam. Now, today, I want to talk about Christianity, because here in the West, that's west of Turkey, here in the West, we practice Christianity and have practiced it for an absolute minimum of 2,020 years. Arguably, it's a little longer than that. But effectively, the calendar that we operate off of operates off of the life and the end of life of a man known as Jesus of Nazareth. And so how does that apply to honest, open, and willing? The primary way that it applies is that we understand how it is we arrived at the spiritual practice that we embrace, and what the teachings of that practice over the last 2,000 years have left us with. The reality is that from the monotheist philosophical foundation, human beings or human nature is or has been not very well appreciated. We of the West have looked down upon ourselves of having been riddled by something known as original sin as a result of Adam and Eve being manipulated by the devil in the Garden of Eden, which angered God, and God basically removed Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden and put them on earth as physical beings, no longer a spiritual consciousness, where they would pay penance, if you will, for having gone against the will of God. That's how most of us, and that's how much, if not all, of the fundamental Christian teachings operate. Now, Christianity came from the Hebrew, and the Hebrew came from an experience of their prophets. So the story really begins way back. But a great place to start and to understand where we are. And the deal about understanding is so that we can be honest, open, and willing about the changes we experience today in 2020. The short version of the story is the Jews, the Hebrews, who were a tribal crowd, came under the influence of Egypt, and Egypt enslaved them. And out of that enslavement, a prophet rose, and that prophet was Moses. And the God of gods, Yahweh, spoke directly to Moses and guided Moses to bring the people of Israel out of Egypt, out of bondage, into the land of milk and honey. That's where the story, as we basically know it, begins. It really begins in Genesis, in the Garden of Eden. But at that point, things happened that led to the primary story, or to the point in the story that most of us refer to. So Moses is left with a group of people, a large group of people, who have been in bondage and enslaved for generations. And he is moving those people who have been slaves, who have been treated as animals, like farm animals, or less over generations. And he has them all in a crowd, and they've all believed in paganism. They had really, they'd been in Egypt, and Egypt was not a monotheist crowd or spiritual consciousness. And so many of those Hebrew people had embraced the pagan consciousness. And so when they all left Egypt, that's what Moses was left with. So basically, he didn't have an organization. He basically had a rabble. He basically had just a whole bunch of people. It was almost like herding cats for our buddy Moses. And God came to Moses and spoke to him directly and told him to go get these people and bring them out of Egypt. So Moses was of the opinion he was under direct guidance from the only God, from the one God, to do this thing. And he brings them out, and they have all of this craziness going on. And Moses is beside himself trying to figure out how to manage this herd of cats. And he goes off to the mountain to meditate or pray. But the story goes that he was called by God to go up the mountain. And on the mountain, God, through edict, gave Moses the 10 rules for social interaction and the 10 rules that God expected of his people. They're called the 10 Commandments. Moses came down from the mountain. He had the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments set the guidelines for how things would happen. And these 10 Commandments became the foundation for what we knew then as Hebrewism or Judaism. Then there was a group of people who raised themselves up to be the guides of the whole crowd, or the herd of cats, or the rabble, or the regular people. And they became religious leaders in the Jewish world, and they lived in the temples, and they told the people how they would live so that God would like them and let them into heaven. And then it was thought that this isn't right, this isn't going well. There's a whole lot of people who are being left out, and the whole time the Jewish people are going in and out of slavery to one group or another again and again. And finally, they arrive under the imperial reality of Rome. And at this time, a man Jesus was born. And the man Jesus came to the people and said, I have found some understanding here. I am sent to tell you that the rules and the regulations that the Pharisees and the rabbis are laying upon you are beyond your ability to accomplish. And that there are only a couple of things you need to do to fulfill the desire of your one God. And there's a whole story about what happened to this man Jesus. And in the period of that, this man Jesus became aware of his divine self. He became aware of what was told in the Bible in Genesis about being made in the image and likeness of God. He became aware that he, in fact, was not his body, but was in fact that spark of God which animated his body. He became enlightened. He became the Christ. To be the Christ is to be conscious of the divine reality of one's existence. And so the Christ of Jesus went to the Jewish people and said, all of these rules that are in place coming from the temple, coming from the rabbis, coming from the Pharisees. Pharisees were basically lawyers. All of the guidance and rules coming from these folks is not so that you may realize the presence of God and raise yourself to an experience of heaven on earth. All of these rules and guidelines are simply set out to maintain control over you, the rabble, the herd of cats, humanity. This definitely threatened the temple, the rabbis, and the Pharisees. The story goes that the rabbis and the Pharisees were so threatened that they went to their overlords, the Romans, and convinced them that something had to be done about this lunatic, Jesus. And so, as the story goes, Jesus was crucified, which was a pretty standard practice 2,000 years ago in the Middle East, in Jerusalem. And then, as the story goes, to show that man is not the body, to show that man is made in the image and likeness of God, the soul, the essence of man, is made in the image and likeness of God. The Christed Jesus did not remain in the tomb. He re-manifested himself right out in the presence of those who were following him, and basically said to them, I charge you with the responsibility of letting everybody know that'll listen to you that the rules and regulations laid down upon the people, the Jewish people, by the rabbis and the Pharisees, no longer are the way. The way now is only two commandments, two rules, only two rules coming from the Christed Jesus. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And they went out and they taught that. And there was all different sects and all different groups and all different everybody's going everywhere. And they were all over the place. And there was all different kinds of quote unquote Christians, or a better way to describe it would be followers of the message of the Christed Jesus. So Rome, which was happening at that time, was in big power and then began losing power. And as Rome began losing power, the infiltration of the Christed message began infiltrating the Roman Empire's pagan consciousness. And day by day, one by one, the number of monotheist, one God people began to multiply and multiply and multiply until they became a group spread out through the Roman Empire that had enough impact to call forward a Roman emperor, Constantine, who saw that it was in his best interest as the emperor and in his best interest as the leader of Rome to figure out a way to incorporate this monotheist concept into their pagan religious consciousness and allow Rome to survive, is basically what it boiled down to. And so Constantine gathered a group of elders and learned men who were learned in the message of the Christ from multiple different places with multiple different ideas on how to practice this message from the Christ in Jesus. He put them together and he said, okay, so we need to write a book that will guide this group of people to become good Roman, cancel that, to become good Romans, Roman subjects. We need to present to the people a vehicle that allows them to worship the way they want to worship, to eliminate much of the pagan consciousness that is no longer desirable or acceptable. Move in this monotheist, this Christian idea, yet allow me, the emperor, to maintain control. The Bible was born. The particular event that bore the Bible is called the Nicene Council. And so time goes by a little further. There's some infighting between the now Christian crowd. There were certain sects of the Christian crowd that were less desirable to the Roman message of Christianity than others. Those particular sects were eliminated, literally. And day by day, the one thought about Christianity manifest. And it manifested under the direction of the Roman emperors and continued under the direction of the Roman emperors until the Roman emperors went out of existence. And then that same group of people now come under the guiding influence of the Christian emperor known as the Pope. And the Pope moved forward. And the Pope did what the Pope did. And the Pope went on and all was well, and Christendom became Catholicism. And Catholicism, which means universal, is the Roman side, which was the Western side, and the Eastern side, which was in Constantinople. And there was a period in time when the Roman Pope lived in Constantinople, and Constantinople was the center of Christendom. And then it moved back to Rome, and then those two sects separated. And so now there are basically two primary sects of fundamental Christian consciousness. There's the Orthodox sect or the Eastern sect, and there's the Western sect, the Roman Catholic sect. Things moved along. There was these differences between these two crowds, but those two crowds, the Eastern sect and the Western sect, had a common enemy, which was the third group of monotheism, which was Islam. And Islam was rising from Muhammad, and Islam's philosophy of monotheism was coming to take over the world. And so the two sides of the Christian consciousness, the Eastern side and the Western side, joined together and sent armies to the Middle East, what we know the Middle East today, what was then the Ottoman Empire, to thwart the movement of Islam. Didn't work too well. And there was continuing struggle between Christianity and Islam all the way up to the point where Islam was held back from entering Vienna. And I'm sorry, sitting here right now, I can't tell you that date. I want to say it's something like 800 something. But they were pushed back from Vienna, and their influence then began to dissipate and become less and less. Not long after this, a couple of hundred years, and the dark ages happened in the West, and a lot of other things happened. But basically, it boiled down to the Western Christian church, the Roman Christian church, Roman Catholicism, began doing things that were just pretty seedy. And one of them was to sell to the people penance into heaven. So you could go to your local priest and you could buy from him your family members or your children's entrance into heaven by buying these chits, if you will. And that was all fine and good until Martin Luther resisted it. At the presence of Martin Luther and the resistance against the doctrines, the rules that Rome was laying out happened, he protested that. He stood in the face of Rome. He put himself at great risk of life and death. And the resistance stood. And what we have as a result of that is Protestantism. The separation between Roman Catholicism, Greek Orthodoxy, and the Protestant movement, which then generated most of the religious sects that we know in the West today, most of them. Lutheranism, Calvinism. Now, in this time period, actually before Luther, King Henry VIII separated from Rome because the Pope wouldn't give him the right to marry multiple times. So he separated from Rome. And out of that became the English version of Catholicism, which we know today as Anglican. And so there is a basic history of how it is that Christianity arrives in the United States of America today. And you say to me, well, how is it that what you just told me refers to open, honest, open, and willing? I simply gave you a very short thumbnail sketch of how Christianity has arrived to the United States today. So that's my honest, very simple, leaves out all detail, but honest representation of how that happened. The openness is the ability for one to simply hear it, just to be able to sit in the presence of it and hear it. And the willingness comes from the allowing for the possibility that how Paul loosely described it is so. So to be open, honest, and willing, the how to understand how we arrive at the understanding of Christianity today in America, the rules and regulations to be a Christian and what must be done and what's important, the how to embrace that comes from an honest, open, and willing desire to understand what's going on. It took longer than I expected to make that little explanation. But what I want to tell you is that it changed and changed and changed again. And the teachings for that have continued to morph into the next and the next and the next until we come to the year 2020, in where we have a much more expanded understanding of how the spiritual development of the image and likeness of God has manifest. And when I come back to see you next Monday, I will continue the story from there. I love you all very much. I thank you for allowing me to give this little history lesson, very loosely, very loose history lesson, and for your honest, open willingness to hear what I had to say. I salute you as the presence of God. I salute you as the manifestation of God in this three-dimensional plane as a human being. Namaste. Namaste. Namaste.